This is the time of year when I'm out and about a lot doing lots of teaching because it's autumn and so it's bulb planting time. And I can hand over lots of information about our trials of different varieties, but also about methods like how to keep grey squirrels off your bulbs, etc., etc. So there's lots coming up. Courses at Perch Hill from October the 21st to the 24th, covering all my classic courses. I'm also at Gate Street even the week before that. That's the most beautiful venue in the Surrey Hills from the 14th of October till the 16th of October. So check that out with lots of different subjects. I'm then at Oxley's Barn in Gloucestershire from the 11th to the 14th of November, so a bit nearer Christmas, and we're going to be doing quite a bit on Christmas there. And finally, I've got a week of courses at Perch Hill again, really concentrating on Christmas from the 18th to the 20th of November. So I hope you'll find something that might interest you amongst some of those. See you then. Welcome to Grow Cook Eat Arrange, the podcast of me, Sarah Raven. And today I'm going to talk about succession of colour, really focusing on bulbs because as we get into September, it's bulb planting time. And I have been thinking about a new book that I'm doing with Jonathan Buckley, again, a photographer who I've been working with for 30 years. And it's going to be about succession of colour, really, at Perch Hill, and themes of colour through the different gardens. And the garden that was the second garden that I made here is the Oast garden at Perch Hill. And I was totally addicted to growing cut flowers when I arrived. So I did that first of all. But then within 18 months of moving, what I realised is that we had this rather amazing space between the Oast house, which was quite dilapidated and had fallen down to one floor, so just ground level, and the cowl, which is the round thing on an Oast house. And I'm sure you will know what Oast houses do, but maybe not if you're in Australia or America, which I know we have a few listeners who are. So what Oast houses do is they dry the hops which flavour the beer. And they have a ground floor where the hops are brought in the carriages, and then they're put up on a balcony, which is called a green stage. And from there, they're fed in to an open slatted floor with a fire quite far underneath, so it doesn't burn the planks or the hops. And then above it is this strange cone-shaped chimney with what's called a cowl on top, which rotates round. And that is what an Oast is. And we have one here which we restored, and it was the sort of first building that we restored when we came here. And that was in 1993, and we restored the Oast in 1996. Anyway, once we'd done that and we'd sort of looked at it, I suddenly realised that there was this rather lovely, what could be a courtyard garden between the Oast and the farmhouse. And it was where the cars parked. And you drove round the back of the Oast, came round the corner and parked between the farmhouse and the Oast house. And it just seemed to me to be a terrible shame to have cars filling what could be the most lovely garden. So I got rid of the cars and put a garden. And that's the Oast garden. And having been a florist in London in the previous few years, I got quite bored of sort of bridal white with a splash of blue, because that's what florists end up doing a lot of, which is really lovely, is wedding flowers. But people tend to become suddenly very conventional on their wedding day and want mainly white with a touch of another colour. And so in reaction, in a way, when I was making my own garden, I was looking for really saturated colours, almost the opposite of white. And so I started putting in very strong and rich coloured bulbs. And that is the origin of both the dark and rich palette, which I've talked quite a bit about. And there'll be a reference at the end of this in the podcast notes to one of the podcasts that I've done on palettes, but scattered through with what I call the boiled sweets, which are, so the dark and rich are crimson, mahogany, rich, dark, sort of ochre golds, etc. And the boiled sweet are what they sound like. So blackcurrant, lime, raspberry, strawberry, orange, lemon. So the really vibrant colours. And that's what I put in the Oast garden from the get-go. And that's what we've stuck with. And that's what I want to talk about, is a succession of having these really lovely, luscious, rich, saturated colours in a garden right the way through from the middle of February until really the middle or end of November. And I want to give you a list of bulbs that would deliver that guaranteed all the way through those months without the colour bar dropping too much. So we're going to start with February. February's tricky, obviously. There aren't that many plants that are looking lovely. But in the bulb group, there are two really that possibly three, but really two that we focus on in the garden there. And the first are the Iris reticulatas. So these are the little miniature irises, and they come in lots of colours, but including a really rich amethyst purple. There's a variety called Perch Hill, for instance. There's a variety called George, both really deep velvet amethyst purple. And they're always in flower pretty much by Valentine's Day in that garden because it's quite sheltered. So where do we use these tiny things in such a big space? In the top of pots. So we have these big Danish pots all the way down the sides, both sides of the path, and they go in the top layer of a bulb lasagna in those pots. And we store them from one year to the next. So out they come in May, and back they go in October. And so we don't have to buy new ones every year at all. So it's not expensive, and they are guaranteed to flower in February. So they're in the top layer of a bulb lasagna. And they are wonderful because they really lift the spirits in February. And the other one that I would incredibly vouch for pots, but also in the ground, in a sunny sheltered spot with good drainage, are the Anemone coronarias. And from February into March, those large flowered, real sort of cartwheel saucer flowers, anemones, the so-called florist anemones, are really fantastic for this rich, saturated palette. And there's a variety in a really wonderful, very, very bright pink called Sylphide, which is Sylphide. And there's another one called Mr. Fokker, and I'm going to spell that because it's Fokker and not how it might sound. And then there's a very amazing red called Hollandia. And all those are just beautiful and are really perennialised in the garden there from February into March. Now, you could, of course, add crocus, but do you know what? I find crocus in a border and in pots weather dependent. And in nice years, where it's not super cold and not super wet, they look good. But if it is wet, windy, or really frosty, I find they get quite battered. So for me, it's first of all the Iris reticulatas, moving on to the anemones for February into March. And then in March, another really glamorous, wonderful bulb comes into flower, or series of in a family, which are the imperial fritillaries, Fritillaria imperialis. These are related to the lily family, and they are statuesque and extremely, they stand perhaps 75 centimetres, a metre tall, got these huge bells in great sort of hanging droplets at the top of the stem, like a sort of crown, really. And if you flip one up and look into the apex of that bell, you'll see it's got a huge dew drop of nectar at the apex of every one of those bells. And it's just so lovely. And in fact, I think the flower's divided into 5 sections, so there are actually 5 dewdrops. I'm not 100% sure about that, but I'm pretty sure that they have a 5 division in each flower. And you have these huge nectar drops at the apex of each flower. But as well as being important for the pollinators, and irises and then the imperial fritillaries are rich in nectar and are very, very, very good for feeding the early emerging bumblebees. But also they make your garden look incredible from very early on in the year. And that for me is just so useful to have that scale and that drama, before you've got anywhere near the other things like euphorbias filling out and sort of filling the garden around them. And the biennials are yet to flower too. So even things like Honesty won't have got going. But the Imperial Fritillaries jolly well will have done. So we grow quite a lot here. We grow Orange Beauty, Red Beauty. We grow the crosses with the persicas like Fritillaria radiana, which I think is from Syria. Anyway, there are lots, and they're really fantastic for February into March. And then, of course, in April, we move on to tulips. I haven't mentioned daffs here, narcissus here, because to be honest, a lot of them have white in. And the really, really full-on golds, I'm not so very keen on. So we don't actually use narcissus in this garden. We move straight on to the early tulips. And one of the first tulips that we use really in quite large quantities in there is Orca, which is guaranteed to flower in March. And then we have another one, which is really fantastic for being early and very, very showy and sort of holding its own in glamour, moving from March into April. In that garden is Ballerina. And Ballerina really does flower in the Oast garden from early April onwards. And it smells of freesias, and I'm sure you know it. It's a real boiled sweet orange. So Orca then goes into Ballerina. And we have then a whopper scarlet and orange variety, which is a fully double called Queen's Day. And those, when they're at their best, the flowers would fill and completely cover a side plate. I mean, they are massive, so more than a saucer. They're as big as a side plate. So tulips are go-go. I could go on about tulips for a whole episode. But so we've got iris and we've got the anemones, February. For March, we've got the Imperial Fritillaries. For March into April and on into May, we've got tulips. And the latest tulip to flower in that garden tend to be the parrot varieties. There's a really good new parrot called Negrita parrot, which we find flowers almost twice as long as others. But because of the rich palette in there, we also grow Palmyra, which is a double crimson, really, really lovely. And again, very long flowering. But there are lots and lots of tulips that will take you through from the middle of March till the middle of May. And then what happens is the last tulip drops its petals. And what comes next? Well, that's the alliums. So I did a whole episode on alliums in August. So you could go back to listen to that if you're particularly interested in alliums. But in that garden there, we just have one, actually. To keep things simple, we just have Allium Purple Sensation. And we have introduced another one called Allium Magic in there, which flowers a bit later. But Allium Purple Sensation is the main one en masse. And as May turns to June, we also have Allium Christophii, which is a slightly more mauvey purple than Purple Sensation, which is why it's mainly Purple Sensation in there because of the boiled sweet palette. But Christophii is so showy and so crazy that we have introduced a few of those in there, and it's very happy. And then what happens, as Allium Magic and Allium Christophii are emerging into flower in June, out come the lilies. And my favourite lily in there is a variety called Claude Schreider. And I think it's got Martkin genes because it has the hanging Turk's cap type of head. And of course, I love Lilium Regalis for their scent. I love Lilium Regalis album, but we don't have any white in this garden here at all. It has to be the saturated colours. So Claude Schreider, which is a sort of smoky, pinky, it's sort of quite difficult to describe. It kind of reminds me of silk chiffon in the kind of crimson pinky range. It's just so beautiful. And we have a lot of others. We have Henryi, which is very scented, can get up to honestly 8 foot, and that likes dappled shade. And that's one of the trumpets, but it's a species really, really, I think it's a cross hybrid. Anyway, it's really, really splendid. And orange, of course, fits very, very well in there. And lots of Martins are in the dappled shade under the wisteria. And so in terms of bulbs, various different ones coming on from really early June right the way through until September, actually, with the ones like Ushida, which is another of the sort of Turk's cap types, Lilium speciosum rubrum and Lilium speciosum Ushida. So those really carry us through the lilies. In July, we're lucky enough to manage to have sort of got well established now a few Eremurus rockets. So up they come as the lilies go over and the alliums are turning to seed heads. But we haven't yet harvested the seed heads. Up come the Eremurus rockets. And we have an orange in there called Cleopatra. And then, of course, we've got nothing to worry about because as they go over, the dahlias pick up the colour baton. And the earliest dahlias to flower in there are the anemone flowereds and the singles. And I grew a pack of Dahlia Bishop's children for the Oast garden maybe 15 years ago now. And they come in orange, ochre, scarlet, and sort of carmine pink. And they are dotted through and also grown in the pots, in the containers. And we also have Totally Tangerine in the pots, which is a lovely orange. And a variety named after me, Sarah Raven, which is again in the right sort of colour range, which is in the anemone flower group, so good for pollinators. But lots and lots of luscious dahlias. There are so many to choose from in this either punchy, bold sweet colours or in the dark and rich range. And so, really, that takes us through until it gets too cold and wet and the garden gets kind of rather mushy and a bit sort of sodden, to be honest. And we cut back the dahlias and we don't have that long to wait until the Iris reticulatas come into flower again, having been planted in the pots with the bulbous annuals below them, with the Iris reticulatas starting the circuit again. The Iris reticulatas doing February, with the coronaria anemones, the imperial fritillaries do March, April into May, it's tulips, May into June, it's alliums, June into July, it's lilies, July onwards, it's Eremurus, and then dahlias taking us through until the winter. So there you are, a bulb succession to give you guaranteed saturated, brilliant, cheerful colour right the way through, pretty much right the way through the growing year anyway. Thanks so much for listening. Next week, I'm on my own again, and it's part of this same sort of theme of enhancing your garden next year, now in autumn. And I'm going to talk about bulbous annuals and how you can keep grey squirrels off your bulbs, whether they're in borders or in pots, with pot toppers and rose prunings. So I'm going to give you the results of our trialling here, so join me then.
You can find more information, photos and advice sheets on all the plants and recipes we talk about on this podcast by heading to the show notes or at sarahraven.com/podcast.